So we're going to focus here on the rest of the southern colonies and how they developed here in the Americas, beginning with Maryland, which was originally thought up of by George Calvert, who was known as the Lord of Baltimore, hence why the capital of Maryland is Baltimore. He wanted to find a colony that he could create for a place for Catholics, right? During the Protestant Reformation, Catholics are still now a separated small group now within Britain. So he wanted to find a safe haven for Catholics to be able to practice freely. So he requested a charter from King Charles I in 1632. And the charter was granted, but it's going to fall to his son Cecilus, who actually inherits the charter and is the one who comes over to establish the colony. Right? So Maryland is a proprietary colony. Remember, that means that the colony's owner controls the colony. The owner is the one who's in charge of controlling the colony and setting up the colony and ruling over the colony how they want to organize it. Eventually, Protestants began arriving in Maryland, and this did cause an initial conflict between the two groups. Now you had Protestants and Catholics living together. So in 1649, there was a new law that was passed, and that was the Toleration Act of 1649. And this made it illegal, right, to persecute any Christian for religion. And what's important about this Toleration Act historically is the fact that here in the Americas, it's the first law supporting religious tolerance in the English colonies, right? This is the first time that we're going to see that. We actually have a legal mandate that is supporting religious tolerance. And it's going to continue this way until about 1654. In 1654, the Protestants pretty much gain control of the local government, and this act is pretty much revoked, and the tolerance within Maryland begins to kind of diminish after that. Let's take a look at the Carolinas next. So the Carolinas was first established as a reward by the king to his supporters. And so large portions of land that was south of Virginia and right above Florida at that time, which was still part of Spain, was given to his supporters. So these were aristocratic supporters, right? They were of the very high noble class. And these supporters named their proprietary colony Carolina in honor of Charles II, who was King of Britain. Most people living in the northern half of Carolina were originally Virginians. They were from Virginia who were living in the South now, and most people in the southern half came from England with slaves, and they were attracted by the idea of land, of religious tolerance, and self-government. So they were two different types of people, one who were already established here in the settlers, and those that were coming directly in from Britain. It was very difficult to rule both sides, both north and south of the land of Carolina. So South Carolina decided to split from the North. In 1729, we had North and South Carolinas as two separate royal colonies now. They also became royal colonies and fell under the control of the King of England. Georgia was the last British colony that was founded here in North America by James Oglethorpe. King George II was king at that time in England, and he granted a charter for Oglethorpe to begin a colony for debtors, right? Debt was an illegal crime in England at that time. If you owed money and was not able to pay money, you were sent to jail for being in debt. So the colony was supposed to be an alternative to jail and a new start for these people within Britain. That was James Oglethorpe's overall vision for Georgia. He had very strict laws in his colony. He didn't want to have the large plantations that you saw in Virginia, the very large plantations owned by a few people. He didn't want rum. He didn't want the idea of slaves. He wanted the people within Georgia to really kind of work for themselves. The problem was that few settlers who came over to Georgia were actually debtors. And so Oglethorpe's big plan was not something that he could really follow through on. So he kind of gave up on his plan, and Georgia eventually becomes a royal colony in 1752. And we begin to see the establishment of the things that we see with the other southern colonies, and you see the establishment of the plantations and the influx of slaves to work on those plantations as well. When we take a look at all of the Southern colonies together, right, the culture and the system that develops in the South, they create their own kind of Southern identity, right? The Southern colonies were different from the Middle colonies, from the New England colonies that we're going to see as we go through these screencasts together. So some of the things that we need to consider when we're talking about the Southern colonies and what it was like down there, right? The Southern colonies were primarily identified by plantations. They were filled with these plantations. And it wasn't like there was a lot of people with plantations. It was a small number of plantations. They were just extremely large. The majority of people living in the Southern colonies still lived in relatively small farms and didn't really have that many slaves. But when you were talking about this class of people, the very aristocratic rich class who were able to afford these acres and acres of land of these plantations, this was the small group that did have a large amount of slaves, did control all of these cash crops in the South, like tobacco, indigo, and rice, and they were also the ones who controlled most of the power and wealth within the South. People lived far apart because of the fact that you had these plantations and these farms, right? People couldn't really live close together. There was really almost no other types of manufacturing in the Southern colonies except for agriculture. So you didn't really find a lot of other types of businesses or industries in the South. A small number of wealthy people lived in the South, and they're the ones who had these large plantations with large amounts of slaves. They controlled all of the money and the power. The wealthiest lived in what was called the Tidewater section of the region, which is where you found the best land. It had access to the river and ports to be able to ship their things across the ocean as well for trade. Slavery was definitely extremely important in the southern states because it was what the agricultural economy depended on, right? You depended on the slaves to be able to grow all these crops and harvest these crops. There was only a small number of citizens, and these were these very rich aristocracy that owned the slaves. But those slaves were integral, they were essential for agriculture and for the economy of the South to function. Slaves outnumbered their owners. And so strict slave codes were always kept in the South in order to keep the slaves in control, in order to prevent rebellions from happening, because there was such a large number of slaves that were needed to work on all of these farms. In the South, right, we talked about the House of Burgesses. So there was elected representative assemblies that you found throughout the rest of the Southern colonies. It began with the House of Burgesses. Other colonies had other similar types of assemblies. They were usually bicameral, which meant one assembly or one house was elected by the people, and the other house was appointed by the royal governor, right? So you had a two-house system, and that was a very common type of local government that you found throughout the rest of the Southern colonies as well. So this is primarily what made up Southern identity here within the Southern colonies. And as we go through the other screencasts, we'll talk about the identities that formed in the other colonies as well, the Middle and the New England colonies, and we can then compare how all of these cultures and the identities of these people, their experiences, were very different depending on the region of the British colonies that you were living in.